copy of the essay, The American Revolution, Radical or Conservative?
Yes.
7 right round. Alright. Once in a while we're going to do this. We're going to do it again tomorrow, actually, because I have 2 really good essays on 2 topics that I think are interesting and relatable, and it is also good to have you guys read good writing kind of together in a group setting. So we're going to deal with this essay today. Was the American Revolution Radical or Conservative? It's an excerpt from the prologue of a book called The Founders at Home by a guy with a great name by the name of Myron Magnet. I don't know what your parents are thinking, but Myron Magnet it is. He's an American author. The book is new, just came out last year. It's a good book. So we're going to take a look at this. So before we get into this question with any degree of formality, there are 2 words that we kind of need a working definition of. And what words are that? Radical or conservative. Because the title of the essay is begging you to answer the question. As you imagine, he's going to answer the question in the essay. What does it mean to be radical?
Radical.
What does that mean? In a political sense, crazy? Okay.
What do you say in the sentence?
I'm sorry?
Can you give an example in the sentence? Radical. Radical.
Before I do that, I want to see if someone knows the meaning of the word. Out of the norm. All right. Unusual.
Enforce change upon,
That started out very powerful. What do you mean enforce change?
I don't know how to do this. So I want to explain it.
Dramatic.
Take your time.
I know what it means, but I just don't want to explain it.
Well, you try. Like, what does it mean to be a radical? What sort of change would you advocate?
Policies.
No, conservatives and radicals both promote policies. So what makes a radical a radical?
They don't choose like a side.
Yeah.
Isn't that a radical would be that against what the normal is? So like the cop. Okay, so okay, alright, I'm gonna give you an example. Alright, so the parliament, right? You could believe in the parliament, and then the people who didn't believe in parliament, wouldn't they be a radical?
Not necessarily.
They would go against. They go against the parliament.
Well, couldn't you also go against Parliament by saying, I support a divine right of monarchy?
Exactly, that would be radical.
So what does radical mean then?
Against? Like
Rebellion.
To rebel against,
A social reform.
what kind of social reform?
What is that?
What kind of change? Dramatic, thank you.
Crazy.
I like crazy at the beginning. Dramatic, revolutionary change. A Alright. Not your fault.
A dramatic change. Advocate or explain
Right now? To the kitchen. Okay. Daniela Rubio? They need you in the kitchen. I was just as confused as you were. Alright, so a radical then is someone who kind of goes for extreme change, a break from normal, if you will. So what then is a conservative?
They want to keep it
how it is. Keep the same flow.
I want to try to get away from the idea that a conservative always wants to keep things the way they are. Because if a conservative doesn't like things the way they are, they're not going to be conservatives about that. So let's look to the root of the word. What does it mean? What's conserve? So what does a conservative seek to do?
keep most of the things.
Hold on.
To hold on to
traditional values.
let's not attach political meanings to it. If we're dealing with a conservative of any type, in this class or in politics, the question we have to ask is what? What does a conservative seek to conserve? What does it mean to conserve? To keep.
Protect.
To protect.
As much as possible.
No, not necessarily. A conservative seeks to conserve something, to keep it, to maintain it, to protect it. We're not talking about to what degree, we don't know about what, but the term itself, when we deal with a radical, we want to ask the question, what do you wish to change? What is so bad that it needs to be changed? And when we're dealing with a conservative, we want to ask, what do you wish to, what is good enough for you to want to hold on to, protect, and keep? So this question is asking us, was the American Revolution radical or was it conservative? Was it fundamentally changing something or was it fundamentally keeping something? Now, from what you know about American history, what thinketh thou?
I think it was conservative because they wanted to keep their rights. Like they got used to having rights, so they didn't want to give it up.
Okay. Other thoughts? American Revolution, conservative or radical?
I think radical because they did a lot of things that affected the monarchy directly. With the Boston Tea Party, they do lots of $1 million worth of tea into Harvard. So it hit them really hard.
Okay.
Well, pretty much the case of adding on to that, they changed more things than they saved.
Change more things than they saved. I like that. That's definitely an excellent answer. If you were writing this as an essay, how would you approach that? What would you list? What would your 2 columns be? What would your 2 categories be?
What they kept and
What they kept and what they changed. Very good. That's an excellent way to approach that. Yeah, Danielle.
Wouldn't they be radical because they use force to change something since they had a revolution?
Conservatives can't use force to maintain things?
Yeah.
so it's not how they changed it, it was they changed.
There's a degree of how they changed it. Conservatives are not against change. Conservatives are just against, what's the word that we... Extreme change. That the word, the word kind of in the English, radical change. That a conservative would favor evolution, not revolution.
Evolution.
That a conservative prefers things to evolve rather than to be broken and completely rebuilt. Evolution over revolution is kind of the classic British sense of what it means to be a conservative. All right, let's see what Myron Magnet has to say about the issue. Why don't we start? Helen, would you like to read for us?
All right.
I'm just as excited as you are.
The Founders at Home recounts the American founding from 1735 to 1817 in a series of biographies that together help explain why the American Revolution of all great revolutions was the only successful one.
Stop. What a beautiful opening sentence. What is he positing in this? He's saying, he's putting forth a very clear statement of historical fact here. What is that historical fact that he is putting forth, James?
That the American Revolution was the only successful one.
That we have, the American Revolution is the only successful revolution. And then we figured that somewhere in this essay, what is he going to do? Explain why. All right, keep reading now. Oh, and one more thing before I interrupt Helen again. If there's words you don't know, if there's concepts you want to stop and talk about, literally just go, I don't get that word, what does that mean? And we'll make sure that you understand what is now reading. Go ahead, Helen.
Resulting in 2 centuries and more of unexampled freedom and prosperity. By contrast, the French Revolution, illuminated by America's example and Enlightenment thought, blissful optimism, but collapsed into a blood-soaked tyranny much worse than monarchy it deposed. It spawned a military dictatorship that roiled Europe and half the
So you
globe.
say the word, so you can
Roiled Europe and half the globe for over a decade of wars of grandiose imperial aggression that slew at least 3 million. And the result of 25 years of turmoil, the Bourbon monarchy, minus the enlightenment of its earlier incarnation, settled plumply back on its throne.
What is this a 4-sentence history of? Summary of what? Of the French Revolution. And why is he talking about the French Revolution? What is the author's point in saying, by contrast, the French Revolution, illuminated by American example and Enlightenment thought, began in blissful optimism but collapsed into a blood-soaked tyranny much worse than the monarchy it deposed. What's the author's purpose in that sentence, Lisbeth?
The French Revolution failed, and instead of freedom, it created a much stronger tyranny versus the American Revolution. It actually set freedom to the whole nation.
Excellent. So here we have, the American Revolution was the only successful revolution. Here's an example of an failed revolution. 25 years of turmoil, 3 million dead, Napoleon, and at the end of it, I love that, I love the imagery that the Bourbon monarchy settled plumply back on its throne. Who was in charge of France at the end? The same Bourbon monarchy that they had gotten rid of a quarter century earlier. The hell's the point of that? Is kind of the idea here. Anaya, would you read the next one?
The Russian Revolution switched one.
Despotism. What is a despotism and a despot? What is a despot?
I think I was the one with this.
Despot.
Like desperate? No.
Like a switch or
To get out of.
Like from one thing, like it's
From one choice to another?
position? Is it like?
No, like use what's it?
Let's see if we can figure it out in its context. Keep reading until you see the word despotism again. Go ahead.
Okay, the Russian Revolution switched one despotism
Despotism.
for another, and a century later, after millions of the deaths from its purchased slave camps and purposely inflicted famines, Russia remains a despotism. Oh my God.
Despotism.
Despotism without rights of justice.
Stop. All right, so then can anyone define despotism now? Now it should be clearer in context. Daniela?
Is it like a type of like way of like running a country?
And describe
Or
that.
government?
What kind of... despotism is a synonym for what?
Anarchy.
Not anarchy, no. Dictatorship. Who said that? Is that? Despotism is dictatorship. Unfree government. A despot is a dictator. So the Russian Revolution switched one unfree government for another unfree government. And a century later, after the millions of deaths from its purges, slave camps, and purposely inflicted famines, Russia remains an unfree government without rights or justice. So what's the purpose of talking about the Russian Revolution here?
Another failure.
It's another failure. This is his way of saying, here are some really big failures in a paragraph. Keep reading.
We all get only one life. Imagine someone born under the billowing flags of the new Soviet Union in 1917 who had to live that whole single life without the freedom so much as to speak the truth of the squalid, oppressive reality he saw through his own eyes. One single life, and what you can make of one you have depends so much on what others have done to mold the time and place in which you live.
That's a very interesting statement. This kind of goes against all the crap that you hear at graduation. You can make your future.
Right.
You can do whatever you want. what is this last little last little phrase here saying? That, in fact, what we make of our life is very dependent on what? On what, Deja? Not what we do around.
What our peers do.
Not even our peers.
Where you come from?
What our ancestors have done. Where you come from. Let me ask you a question. Do you think that Sandra's life would look the same as it does now if there had never been a women's rights movement?
No.
No, it looked fundamentally different. Do we think that Deonte's life would look similar now if there was never a civil rights movement?
No.
It would look very, very different, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
That Deonte's life opens up in a lot of ways due to what?
Civil rights.
What people have done years ago. Now, that could also work negatively. That imagine for a moment, Nelsie, if you were born in North Korea. Would your life, would what you could do with your life be different in North Korea as it is in the United States? Yeah. For real sure. That your life in Cuba would be very different, or as John F. Kennedy would have said, Cuba would look very, very different. That's how John F. Kennedy said Cuba. Cuba. Swollen, it's like dirty and oppressive and dank, gray. So, what this guy is saying, and I think there's a lot of truth in it, is that where our lives are is very much dependent on those who came before us, for good or for bad. All right. Debbie, would you read the Founders New after this is over?
Can all Ruby students please come down? All Ruby students, please come down. Also, senior club, please meet in room 21. Again, any senior club members, please report to room 21 for the meeting. And there will be a sophomore class meeting today at 4 o'clock in room 10 with Mr. Sedano. All right, thank you.
All right, go ahead, Debbie.
The founders knew that truth so well that they announced their nationhood by significantly changing John Locke's Catalog of Natural Rights. The shift begins in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, in which George Mason amended Locke's right to lives, liberties, and estates to life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. 2 months later, Thomas Jefferson penned the final pithy formulation of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence.
All right, so what's the point of those couple sentences? What's the author saying here?
This is the beginning of success.
What do you mean?
I was like to myself,
What's the author saying here? He's kind of going through, we started with John Locke, lives, liberties, and estates, and ended with Jefferson's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. How it changed. That the wording of this changed in what he's going to argue is an interesting way. Go ahead, Libby.
The pursuit of happiness.
Yeah, put that exclamation point in there.
Pursuit of happiness.
The pursuit of happiness? The pursuit
of
happiness. It's like one of those games where you pronounce like every word in a sentence with like on the emphasis on a different word. Like the pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness. Any sentence you can play this game. Oh. Will you go out with me? Will you go out with me? Will you go out with me? You go out with me? Will you go out with me? Totally changes the Anyway, the pursuit of happiness? Go.
Who but the Americans made a revolution to vindicate the paramount right of each individual to try to make the most of his life by his own effort as he sees fit.
Okay, what's that mean? Vindicate the paramount right of each individual. Good question. What do you mean to vindicate? make clear, justify, to defend. And what is paramount? High point. So, very good, Lorna. Lorna, what's this sentence mean? Who but the Americans made a revolution to vindicate the paramount right of each individual? What's the point of the American Revolution?
To make clear the I need to process. Where is the word?
Process away.
To make clear, like, everything that Americans are entitled to, or like all of our rights.
Why did the according to Myron Magnet, why did the Americans make a revolution? Elizabeth. What?
They wanted to be free.
Specifically to do, why does he put that giant exclamation point after pursuit of happiness?
Because you wanted to be happy.
Oh.
Not,
You want to stay happy?
Alright, let's approach the question like this. What does Jefferson mean when he writes pursuit of happiness?
They were sad for so long, they want happiness.
To find
On their way to
find
find happiness.
the status.
They can find happiness in any way they want.
We should.
Keep asking it.
To find what they were missing. To become happy as their own.
Alright, let's think about it like this. Jefferson replaces what with pursuit of happiness? Property, the right to your estate. Why does he make that replacement? What is this revolution about? What does Myron Magnet say? And what do we mean by liberty?
Your own rights.
What does Myron Magnet say?
Have your own life.
What, have your own life. What is the words that he uses? Who but the Americans make a revolution to do what? To be happy. What is the most important thing of the American Revolution, says Myron Magnet? That every person should do the revolution to vindicate the paramount right of each individual to try to make the most of his life by his own effort as he sees fit. To live to your potential, to your highest ability. Guys, this is unusual. You know, that's radical. I mean, that is the reason why we chose to commit treason against the king and fire on the king's troops and put ourselves up against the most powerful military in the world for happiness. That's kind of cool, in a sense. Like, I mean, when you think about it, most of the times throughout history, what are people going to war for? Land,
Money.
treasure, oil, women. They're going to war. But here we have a revolution begun so that ordinary individual people can do what?
Be happy.
Try to be happy. Live their life. Make the most of your life by your own effort as you see fit. Yes?
Isn't there like a little bit of contradiction because of the fact that the last paragraph was talking about how, like, and you can't fight for whatever you want. Like how you said, like the Soviet Union lived a single life without freedom so much as to speak the truth.
Right.
Like, and here it's saying like how they want something and they're fighting for it.
Right.
And how in the last paragraph, like, they didn't fight for it.
Who didn't fight for it?
Like the people that were in like the Soviet Union, kind of.
Well, why didn't they?
Because
I don't see the connection that you're making. He's using this paragraph on the Russian Revolution as an example of a failed revolution. I mean, look, the people that started the Russian Revolution started it to create a stateless, classless, communist utopia on Earth. Okay? That the point of launching the revolution is to create a classless, equal paradise. What happened with that classless, equal paradise? That it became a squalid, oppressive reality that no one could dare speak the truth of unless you get your ass hauled off to a gulag. The point of the Russian Revolution is to establish complete equality among mankind. What's the point of the American Revolution? To pursue individual happiness, to be able to achieve your life's ability. There's no comparison between these two sentences. He's just using the Russian Revolution as an example of a failed revolution. You know, to get into why all that happened, you'd have to study the Russian Revolution, obviously. But, I mean, he's right that the the Soviet Union was not a glorious, classless, stateless utopia. It was a squalid, unfree, oppressive place to live for 75 years. Russia is not a pleasant place to live. So, we start with this uniqueness that the American Revolution was fought for whom? Individuals. Individuals, not these gigantic conceptions of class or race, but for ordinary individuals. All right, let us keep reading. How about Elizabeth? Would you like to read? Read, s'il vous plaît.
A key reason the key reason the revolution succeeded was its strictly limited scope.
Stop! What does that sound like? The key reason the revolution succeeded was its strictly limited scope.
They had one goal.
What in the writing, the purpose of what is this in the essay? What is this? This is his thesis. Here is my thesis. Why? He posits the question at the beginning, why was the American Revolution the only successful one? And here, he answers it. The American Revolution was the only successful one. Why, Elizabeth?
Because,
Was it?
Oh, it's strictly limited scope.
All right, keep reading.
Okay. The founders sought only liberty and not equality or fraternity. They aimed to make a political revolution, not a social or economic one.
Stop. Here's your thesis. Why we have a revolution. For what purpose? No. What's the thesis? What is his thesis statement?
It's not liberty.
It's not liberty.
It's liberty.
They aimed to make a political revolution for what was their political revolution to do? For liberty. And what made it limited? What were they not seeking to do? No social revolution and no economic revolution. This is his thesis. Why was the American Revolution successful? Well, it's because it was limited to a political revolution for liberty and was not an economic or social revolution. Now, you assume that somewhere in the lines of this essay, what is he going to do with this now? Explain it. All right. Keep reading, Elizabeth.
And it didn't seed with an old world intensity of social rancor or class greed. Their Lockean social contract philosophy taught them that the preservation of individual liberty was the goal of politics. Its basis was the surrender of a portion of man's original natural freedom to get a government that would protect the large remainder of it better than any individual would do on his own.
Is that unfamiliar to anybody? That's what we were talking about all last week. What's the point of government? Protect your rights. Go on.
The freedom to make your own faith, think your own thoughts, and own your own property without fear of bodily harm, unjust imprisonment, or robbery. The founders' study of history taught them that the British Constitution under which they had lived, originally and essentially free, as Boston preacher Jonathan Mayhew described it, was the idea embodiment of such a concept.
So this is interesting. What's this last little part here, Steve? What did the founders' study of history teach them? What constitution was perfect?
The British.
The British Constitution.
And weren't they rebellion too?
Yes. Which kind of leads us to an interesting question. If the British Constitution was perfect, and why did they rebel against it? Can we answer that question before we get to the next paragraph?
Wasn't it the British Constitution just to protect the British itself and not the Americans?
No.
Because, okay, well, I feel like my explanations might be so, like, all that nothing. But I think they got used to, like, different, like, they thought that, because you know how the neglection, and they just didn't feel like they were right because how they were ignored and they didn't want to do what they did because they wanted to do their own thing, but at the end of the day, they ended up doing the same thing that they did. Okay, I don't know.
It was a different type of freedom.
What do you mean?
Like for the British government, like I don't know, like it was just a different type of freedom for them. For the British government, like they just didn't agree. Like
let's read the next paragraph and see if. Oh, what's the answer, Steph?
Isn't it because the way that the people were represented, because Parliament had some people represent like the colonies, even though they weren't really from the colonies, and the U.S. Constitution, they pick people from the colonies to represent their own colonies.
Actual versus virtual representation, yeah, but that doesn't. We have to. So we have to say the founders' study of history taught them that the British Constitution, under which they had lived, was the ideal embodiment of the way a constitution ought to be. Which begs the question, what happened? Jonathan, would you read for us?
Yeah. Alright. It was the most perfect combination of human powers in society. John Adams wrote in 1766, for the preservation of liberty and the production of happiness, until George III began to violate it.
So what was wrong with the British Constitution?
It was fine.
It was fine until George III started to violate it. Keep going.
So, Americans didn't take up arms to create a new world order according to some abstract theory. They sought only to restore the political liberty they had actually experienced for 150 years, and they constructed their new government to preserve it.
So, what's the answer to the question at the top? Was the American Revolution radical or conservative in Myron Magnet's point of view?
Conservative.
What is it? So then, what's our question we must ask? What is a conservative seeking to? Fred, what are they seeking to conserve here?
Political liberty.
Political liberty. Political liberty that they had never had. Political liberty that what? That they did have in the past. Under what regime? Seth, what did you call? Under what? Under salutary neglect. They were looking to reclaim the political liberty that they felt they had for 150 long years under the regime of salutary neglect. So in this estimation, this is a conservative revolution because A, it's trying to conserve something, not create something new, and B, it's conservative in its limited goals. All right, let's see what he starts to say about this. How about, Eddie, would you read?
Because democratic self-government requires a special kind of culture, one that fosters self-reliant selves. The Protestantism of the Founding Fathers also helped the revolution succeed. Their Protestant worldview placed an intense value on the individual, his conscience, the state of his soul, and understanding of the Scripture, his personal relation to God, his salvation. It was an easy step for them to assume that, as each man was endowed by his Creator with an immortal soul immediately related to God, so he was similarly endowed with the rights with rights that are not the donation of law, as the Constitution singer William Livingston put it, but prior to all political institution and resulting from the nature of man. It was easy for them to assume, therefore, that the individual, not the state, took center stage in human drama. They saw the state as merely instrumental to the fate of the individual.
Questions on that? That's stuff we should kind of recognize that Rights are not donated to us by law. Rights come from nature or God, or nature's God, or the nature of man, however we want to put it. Want to read? Go ahead.
But their Protestantism, also gave them a history that helps explain why the colonists didn't need or want a social revolution.
Stop. Point of this paragraph. What are we going to explain here?
Why they didn't want to.
Right. So now we are going to have our evidence for why are we not after a social revolution. Go ahead.
The many non-Anglican dissenters among them had already had such a revolution. They had had to uproot themselves from their relatives and friends, from the fair cities, villages, and delightful fields in Britain, fleeing religious persecution into the arms of savages and barbarians, in pursuit of liberty of conscience, as Mayhew put it in 1763. The Plymouth Pilgrims, who wrote a literal social compact in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, were only the first save of the tide of such immigrants fleeing persecution. English and Scottish Presbyterians, Baptists and Quakers, German French
Huguenots,
and others followed.
All right. So what's the main reason? Why no social revolution? Why no social revolution? They already had one. Their social revolution was in what? Religion. Look at all these groups of people. What did they all have to do? Escape religious persecution. Come to a land where there is, in general, what? Religious toleration, at least. That was their revolution. The act of picking up and moving for a change. Keep reading.
In the 18th century, their offspring, John Jay, for example, descended from New York's huge contingent of Huguenot refugees from Catholic oppression, or Livingston, whose Presbyterian great-grandfather fled Scotland for Holland after the Stuart Restoration, had as lively a sense of lucky escape from the old country's murderous religious tyranny as had American Jews whose forebears had escaped Russian pogroms and the Nazi Holocaust in the 20th century. They had as acute a sense of having had to start their lives over again in a land that afforded them almost providential religious and political freedom, safety, and opportunity. They cherished liberty with the clarity and concreteness that only the experience of oppression confers.
So let's summarize that quickly. Why did they not need a social revolution? A, they had already had one, and how did they feel about society in America? They liked it. Liked it so much that what did they compare? What's the historical comparison that this author draws here? That they were as happy to be in America as
the experience a lot of
as who?
The Jews escaped.
As the Jews who had escaped Russian pogroms and the Nazi Holocaust. If you're that happy to be where you are, why are you going to try to change society that much? Probably not going to. They've already had their radical change. Exactly. They're happy with where they are. They don't need another radical change in their society. The next paragraph we were going to skip is just more about the religious aspect of life in revolutionary America. I'm going to read just the last part. Even George Washington, who never knew that his great-great-grandfather, an Anglican cleric, suffered religious persecution at the hands of Cromwell's Puritans, often liked to speak of America with an endearing mix of Old Testament and New Testament echoes as a land of promise with milk and honey, which offered a refuge to the poor, the needy, and the oppressed of the earth, and anyone, therefore, who is heavy laden. He wasn't alone amongst the colonists in thinking of settlement in America in terms of the Israelites' providential deliverance from Egyptian tyranny to the promised land. What's this historical parallel that George Washington and other colonists are drawing. That coming to America is like what? What event, what illusion is being made here? Go ahead, Lisbeth.
It's comparing it's related to when they experienced Egyptian tyranny to the promised land.
Anyone see 10 Commandments, Prince of Egypt, at least know the story of Exodus?
Yeah.
What's the story of Exodus? Moses leads the Israelite people out of slavery in Egypt into freedom in the promised land. It's Exodus, it's the whole second book of the Bible. That's what it's all about. And there's this connection that you are moving from slavery to freedom, to a promised land. All right. How about Jonathan? Would you like to read? You already read. Right. Sorry. Naomi, would you like to read?
Other had made their own personal, social, and economic revolution by uprooting themselves from home and coming to America for economic opportunity.
Stop. What are we going to hear now?
Economic.
Economic. Good. See how he's structuring this? Yes. Keep going.
From laborers signing up as indentured servants up to younger sons of gentlefolk with no inheritance in prospect, immigrants came to make their own fortunes as best as they could. If they believed their rights came from nature, not from government, they believed the same thing of their property. As people had believed from biblical and classical times, and as Locke has re-emphasized in modern era, in explaining the origin of property rights, Locke had remarked of the state of nature that in the beginning all the world was a barren, where people create property by working, the wild common of nature. Their labor made the land and its produce their own. Since labor makes the far greatest part of the value of things we enjoy in this world. In fact, he calculated of the products of the earth useful to the life of man, 9/10 are the effects of labor. Human effort, in other words, guided by human intelligence and imagination, the greatest of all natural resources, transforms the raw material of nature into something of use. We don't eat grain, but bread, for example, which we even take to market over roads we have built to exchange for other products of human industry.
Helen, would you like to pick it up?
The colonists, because they and their ancestors had created wealth out of the wilderness, took for granted, with Locke, their right to their own property. And though they believed in the inborn equality of natural rights, they assumed, with Madison, that in a society where every man had the right to pursue his happiness and forge his fate, the unequal distribution of talents will naturally and unobjectionably produce inequality of wealth.
Okay, hang on a second. Are the founders okay with wealth inequality? Are they okay with rich people and poor people? Yeah. Why? That would be a critical assessment of the founders. Not all, so A, not all of them were that rich, and B, many of them had not started rich. Hamilton, a perfect example. John Adams was born to, lower middle class farmers in Massachusetts. Lincoln's not a founder, but it's all right. Example. So why is economic inequality okay to the founders? Why does that make inequality okay? What does Madison say? Where does inequality of wealth come from? Unequal distribution of talent. What does that mean?
Not everybody
Not everybody is as intelligent, as hardworking, as good-looking, as artistic, as athletic. Like, people are different. And because people are different, not everybody's going to create the same. Exactly. And some people have more God-given ability to draw on. Some people work harder than others. And to the founders, was that okay? Yeah.
It's not their fault.
Natural. Exactly. Totally natural. Keep reading.
So economic equality, as opposed to an equality of rights and equality under the law, was no part of their revolutionary goal. Quite the reverse, an equal division of property, Madison pronounced in Federalist No. 10, would be an improper and wicked project.
So are we, like the communist revolution in Russia, like the Russian Revolution, which seeks an equal distribution of property and an abolition of class difference, are the founders after an abolition of class difference? Are they after, are they trying to abolish classes? No. They are perfectly comfortable with economic class. And their view on it is, well, people have different talents, and therefore people are going to have different outcomes. All right. So, no social revolution. Why?
Because they already had
They already had one. And no economic revolution. Wasn't necessary. Very good. Nelsie, would you read for us?
Calvinists without personal experience of the old world, or see, Miss, I feel nervous with or that were often family memories of of it new from history and sculpture. Scripture, see, of it. No. Of Sarah and Herod, of Caesar, Nero, and Caligula, of Bloody Mary and the Dark Stuarts, that even though government exists to preserve liberty, it too often have been freedoms destroyed. Even more vividly, they knew from the presence of slavery in their own midst just what monstrosities of organized cruelty and license oppressions men are capable of inflicting on one another, given the power to do so, and with tragic irony, the knowledge of their homegrown injustice made them all the more determined never to submit to the crown's efforts to make us as tame and abject slaves as the blacks we rule over which such arbitrary sway. As Washington vowed in 1774, a vow whose full importance has grasped only late in life from.
What is this? What's one reason that Myron Magnet is saying the founders were so intent on preserving their liberty? What were they all too aware of? What is one thing that made founders like George Washington very aware of liberty?
They didn't have liberty.
Who didn't have liberty? Oh, what is this all about? That Washington is determined never to allow the crown to make me as tame and abject a slave as the black slaves that I have. They saw lack of liberty in their own lives. And to them, to Washington and Jefferson and Madison and all of the Southern founders, and listen up to them for a moment, for Parliament to tax them without their consent was just as much a slavery.
Again, seniors, the senior club meeting at 4 o'clock will be held in room 21. Again, senior club meeting at 4 o'clock will be held in room 21. Thank you.
To Washington, taxation without representation is slavery. Just in the same way as him holding slaves that pick his tobacco. Why? Why is that the same thing in Washington's mind? Whose rebels? What do both of those things do? They force people to do things. What's the rest of that sentence? Without what? Without their consent. Without their approval. Washington says if I can't elect people in Parliament that will stand up, that will represent me, that's slavery. Because in Washington's mind, and in Jefferson's mind, and in Hamilton's mind, all slavery is someone making you do something without you having any agency over it. And to them, that's exactly the same thing as they do to their slaves. It's slavery the same way. So does it, is it ironic? Like, yeah, it is. It is wildly ironic. But one of the reasons that they were so interested in liberty is because they knew from personal experience what it's like not to have liberty, because they were the ones denying it to people. We are going to skip to the last paragraph on this page, the American Revolution. And Deja is going to read for us.
The American Revolution then was doubly limited as its aims, limited to making only a political change without altering social or economic arrangements, and determined to set strict limits to its new government. Fearful that any governmental power beyond the barest minimum necessary to protect liberty too easy could become a threat to liberty itself. So apprehensive were the founders on this score that the government structure was erected after the Articles of Confederation proved complete to perform its essential function of protecting their lives, liberties, and properties, adequately prolonging the Revolutionary War and increasing the hardships of the men who fought it. With great misgivings, the founders who had to create a new constitution to give government the necessary powers, but their most urgent concern was to make those powers limited and enumerated, hence drawn with every check and balance they could think of to prevent tyrannical abuse.
So this is just what we talked about, about how replacing, why the articles, and they had to replace the articles, but they had to put all these checks and balances of federalism in there. With similar prudence and modesty, when they root, and this is getting to the Russian Revolution and the French Revolution, with similar prudence and modesty, when they wrote the new Constitution, the founders nursed no grandiose illusions that they were going to change human nature by changing the structure of government. Except for Thomas Jefferson, they did not believe in human perfectibility, as did some of the French philosophes, whose worldview Jefferson had absorbed from his years in Paris, as well as from his voluminous readings. The founders certainly did not aspire to create something like the quote-unquote new Soviet man. They had a very clear-eyed assessment of human nature. After all, their social contract theory rested on a psychology that acknowledged what Patrick Henry called, conventionally enough, the depravity of human nature, with its lusts, aggression, and greed no less inborn than its rights. They tried to create a republic that would flourish with human nature as it was, with all of its cross-grained passions and interests. They never forget, as Hamilton cautioned, that men are ambitious, vindictive, and rapacious. So what are they not trying to change here? Rapacious means you always want something.
Greedy.
Greedy.
Yeah, I'm confused.
What is the founders are creating are they trying to change human nature? No, they're saying, look, this is how human nature is. How do you make a free government accepting that human beings are ambitious, vindictive, and rapacious? What do you think those other revolutions tried to do? Try to do what, Steph? I heard it from over here. Try to do what? Perfect people. These other revolutions said, we are going to come up with the perfect government that will therefore perfect people. That we will change human nature through government. Is that statement radical or is that statement conservative?
That's radical.
That's radical. You don't get a more radical statement than that.
Like what they said, how different talents and all that.
Right. That's
no one could be
the
the same.
founders said. Now the Russians and the French said we are going to change human nature when we change our government. And what the difference I'm going to read the last paragraph too, so just bear with me. We have another minute or 3. The difference, the fundamental difference here, is this is a revolution that tries to deal with, in one sense, that tries to deal with people as they are, not as we might wish people to become. Now, whether that's pessimistic or optimistic, I don't know, but that's what the founders were after. They said, look, here's people. What's the best government that we could create with people being dickheads? Quite frankly. They don't assume that people are always nice and decent. Still, they weren't cynics. They believed men capable of virtue. And they believed that we're going to talk about that virtue. I know I did. Not all men and not all the time, but, quote, if there is not sufficient virtue among men for self-government, then the change of despotism then only the chains of despotism can restrain them from destroying and devouring one another. If people aren't virtuous enough for free government, what's the only way to keep order?
Dictatorship.
Through dictatorship. So then what begs the question? How do you make
a non-dictator government?
Well, they already try to do that. But if you need a virtuous citizenry to have self-government, what's the question that you had better start asking?
Why?
How do you make people virtuous? How do you make people virtuous? Laws make people virtuous?
What's the definition of virtuous?
Virtuous is you do what's right. We're going to talk about virtue tomorrow when we talk about George Washington. It's more than that. We're talking about virtue. Let's hold this question in our minds for tomorrow. What is virtue? Because George Washington embodies revolutionary virtue in people's minds. So when we look at tomorrow, we're going to see what that meant. I'm going to finish up in the last paragraph, so bear with me. The best answer to that fear was the example of the founders themselves, men of luminous public spirit who had no hesitation in appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions in the Declaration of Independence. And that is the last and largest reason why the American Revolution succeeded where others failed. Its leaders were men of extraordinary character, intelligence, wisdom, and in the case of Washington, the founding's presiding genius of heroic private virtue too. There's that word again. They had the unshakable courage to pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor to assure the revolution's success. Already social leaders, professional successes, or both, they had no psychological need to exalt themselves, and certainly not by abasing or terrorizing others, like such revolutionary sociopaths as Robespierre or Lenin, that never dreamed of placing themselves above the laws that they had made as the people's representatives. And they wholeheartedly agreed with Madison that if the spirit that nourishes freedom should ever be so far debased as to tolerate a law not obligatory on the legislator as well as on the people will be prepared to tolerate anything but liberty. And when they had played their parts and done their duty, they were content, indeed eager, to go home. So the question for tomorrow is, what is virtue?
No, you can't do it.
Virtue.
Wait.
So we have, first of all, it's well written. We have, now, tonight's video is going to poke some holes in this. It's going to say, hey, there were some pretty significant social and economic changes that went on because of the revolution. So remember, this is Myron Magnus' point of view. I happen to think he makes a pretty good case, but I want you tonight to kind of be thinking about what are some social and economic changes that are happening as a result of the revolution. All right, go in peace. Oh, can we do a couple things?